Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. This is Dr. Habib. I am here with JP. How are you, sir?
I'm doing really well. Thanks.
Amazing. It's a nice day today. I'm excited to dig into this topic because this is something that I think there's some misinformation out there about, a lot of confusion about overall just fat to begin with, right? Is fat good? Is fat bad? In general, we can talk about the difference between dietary fat and adipose tissue fat, and the fact that they've been linked together, which is actually a fun misnomer. But the idea here is, what is the difference between fat that's on your belly or fat that's all around you under your skin? And what is the difference between visceral fat and subcutaneous fat? So there is a difference here, a big distinction. I want to help dispel some of these myths that are out there. I want to make sure that our listeners are given good information and some guidance on identifying it, figuring out or understanding why they occur, why each one has a specific path or route that it will be created under, and what we can do about it. And there are things that we can do about it. This should be ideally a very empowering episode because there are some very specific strategies, things we talk a lot about, but let's talk about specific strategies for identifying and understanding the difference between visceral and subcutaneous fat.
Yeah, I think this is a really important episode because I think most people recognize that being overweight is something that is a negative. It's a negative for your health, has consequences from, elevated cancer risk to elevated risks of autoimmune diseases to elevated risks of neurodegenerative problems and cognitive issues and even mood problems. So yes, all the way around, being overweight is bad, but let's talk about, the fact that fat that you store under your skin, which is called subcutaneous fat, is very different in its risk factors and metabolic problems that arise as a result of it versus visceral fat. And there's really interesting reasons why your body might choose one over the other. And there's interesting ways you can shift that. And some people, yes, are predisposed to one over the other, and we'll get into why that is. But I think all fat is not equal in any stretch, and I think it's important for people to understand that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned subcutaneous fat. Let's do a quick definition of each so people understand the full context of what we're talking about. So subcutaneous fat is the fat that's located just below your skin. It's literally called subcutaneous, meaning below the cutaneum, which is the skin. So it's just below the skin. It's in the adipose tissue layers that are just below the skin surface. And they generally are kind of, the best way to identify this is kind of like the pinching test. If you pinch and you kind of feel that there's a bit of fat or adipose tissue underneath the skin, that is what we know as subcutaneous fat. There is a difference, and a very important one, when it comes to visceral fat. Visceral fat is the fat that actually is infiltrating onto visceral organs and muscles. So these are the internal organs, primarily of the gut. We tend to find that visceral fat likes to go to the organs within the abdominal cavity, the organs of the gut. So the liver is a major area where this goes to. It often goes to the pancreas as well. And muscle is a huge area where visceral fat can infiltrate and be a major source of health issues. These are not generally pinchable fats. We're not going to feel it or see it just simply with palpation. We're not going to feel it by using our fingers. This is a fat that, to identify it, there are some measures that we can use at home, but the gold standards really are when we go and we look at like a DEXA scan or some sort of imaging that tells us what's going on within the body, and that's how we can identify the risk factor of visceral fat. Now, yeah, please go for it.
Yeah, they also differ really in many important ways with respect to the type of signaling molecules that they release and what signaling responses they have to other signaling molecules, like, and we'll get into it, but stress hormones and inflammatory cytokines and insulin. When you see the differences between those cell types, they're all adipocytes. They're all storing fat in the form of sort of that fat droplet that sits inside and gets smaller when you're lean and bigger when you're fat. And that, but how those cells respond to an excess caloric intake and for storage purposes is very dependent on what your stress state is, what your exercise utilization, how metabolically healthy you are with respect to your mitochondria and what kind of energy usage you're getting. And so all of those things factor into the decision that your body makes as to, okay, I've got this excess energy. I took it in the form of food. I've broken it down into something that's storable, which is a fatty acid. And now I'm going to move it within the body to a different location. And am I going to move it into a location that's near to the organs, or am I going to move it peripherally out to just below the skin? And very different reasons why the body does that.
What are those reasons? Let's talk about what causes the difference between subcutaneous infiltration and actually visceral infiltration.
Well, there's really three major factors that play a role. One is definitely genetics. And when I say genetics, I'm not just meaning your genes. I mean your epigenome as well, because there's a lot of epigenetic factors that control how those cells respond, whether or not they've got lots of cortisol receptors on them, glucocorticoid receptors, and other things on them. They tend to be on the adipocytes that surround the organs. And so as a result, when you're in a stressed state, or when you're inflamed, and that can be inflammation from being sick, but it can also be inflammation in the form of metabolic inflammation. That tissue itself is producing, when it's large, that visceral tissue produces inflammatory cytokines that then feed back and cause more fat to be stored in the visceral tissue. Think of it as um, almost like a stress response. The body says, hey, I don't know whether or not I'm going to have access to food. I don't know whether or not I'm going to have access to, nutrients and what I need to survive. So I'm going to put that fat right by my organs. When you're in a non-stress state, that fat gets stored under the skin, which is much less responsive to cortisol levels and inflammation.
Yeah, so stress levels plays a massive role in whether we're going towards visceral or subcutaneous, and high stress mode, being in generally what we like to call the sympathetic fight or flight or threat response mode, is going to drive more of a visceral fat infiltration specific piece. And you also mentioned the epigenetic factors as well. I think those are hugely important. One big factor that I want to bring up is muscle and muscle fat and muscle use. So there was a really great study that was done and released in 2023 that centered around an AI-based retrospective study telling us whether or not, or was there a factor that radiologically could have been identified that then was linked to mortality in what we call asymptomatic people. So essentially, these people didn't have diseases, they didn't have particular symptoms, and yet they ended up passing away relatively early. And this was a retrospective study that was done on nearly 9,000 people that had CT scans done over a long period of time. And of those 9,000 people, 515, I believe, had passed away. And the retrospective study went back and they basically took their CT scans that had been done over that period of time and fed it into an AI system to help identify through AI-based radiology to identify, was there a factor in these people passing away that we were not aware of or that was not identified, or something that was correlated to their passing. And they said that by far the single most important factor here was myosteatosis. And what myosteatosis is the infiltration of and the presence of fat tissue in your muscle. So myo meaning muscle, steatosis meaning the infiltration of fat or fat tissue, and fat within the muscle. That's visceral fat in muscle. Myosteatosis is a condition or is a finding that this muscle essentially, or these muscles, are not being utilized hyper effectively, and fat is actually coming in and entering that tissue really effectively. This is a huge finding. This is a really important piece to the puzzle. And I believe use of muscle and muscle strength and muscle capacity, something that's been brought to the forefront of our health conversation by Dr. Gabrielle Lyon in her book Forever Strong, and all the work that she does in the fact that muscle is the organ of longevity. So this finding of fat infiltration into muscle tissue was the key predictor factor telling us that we had a higher risk of mortality when we were in this specific situation having infiltration of this fat tissue. Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically what we're saying is when you go to the store and you see the two pieces of, those two ribeyes, one is a choice ribeye and one is a prime ribeye. And you see the choice ribeye is very red. Yes, it has fat, but it's fat outside the muscle tissue. It's very lean meat when you look at it versus the prime piece, which is marbled. It's got streaks of fat all the way through the muscle. Even though the prime steak is the one you want to eat and it's tastier and it's more tender, it is not the healthier one if that's you, okay? What you want is to look more choice, not more prime.
It's so funny you say that. I literally had put that exact image on a PowerPoint that I had done for the Health Upgraded community, and just showed the difference between a choice, or in Canada we call that an A grade beef, and a AAA or prime meat on the opposite side. And I actually went as far as showing Wagyu beef just because I had to. Wagyu being the most marbled, fat infiltrated, like throughout. So you want your body to look lean with fat on the outside, and you want to eat the meat generally because it tastes better and it's much more tender. That you don't want to look like. Isn't that so
you
unique?
You don't want to be tender.
You don't want to be Wagyu beef. Exactly.
You don't want that. So, but then the question is, well, okay, why does that happen? And how is it that this really important relationship that you highlighted between having that myosteatosis in the muscle, where you've got this infiltrated marbling of your muscles, versus being healthy, and the risk of death that comes from that. And this is, putting the pieces together, you realize that what you're talking about when you have that marbling and that infiltration of fat into the muscle tissue is you have a failure of that muscle tissue to be able to handle fatty acid metabolism, that you have become so sugar dependent, so dependent on carbohydrates and sugar for your energy, that your muscles have become, the mitochondria in your muscles have become inflexible. They are not designed anymore, or not capable of using the fatty acids and the ketone bodies that you want your body to be able to do. And we talked about this in the context of being able to lose weight. One of the things that people, we all know, coming up on the end of the year, we're going to see everybody with these fitness goals for the new year, and within 2 weeks on average, 50% or more of all those commitments have been dropped. And the reason is because you will not see, in the first week or so of working out, you are not going to see weight loss. In fact, a lot of people get frustrated because they see weight gain. That's generally water weight. But what's happening is you have to change the mitochondria in your muscles and in your body to be able to lose weight. I've said this many times, because it involves insulin signaling, it involves cortisol levels, it involves your mitochondria being able to take in that liver function. all of those things have to change
And
first.
autonomic signaling too, because if you're stressed about weight loss, then you're stressing yourself further, and that's going to drive you further into sympathetic state,
For
raising
sure.
your cortisol.
For sure. For sure. And the more visceral fat you have, the more cortisol levels you are going to be generating, because you're also generating inflammatory cytokines. So, yes, there's a hurdle that you have to get over. And I generally tell people, listen, do not get on a scale for the first 6 weeks. Just stick
Do it
with
on
it.
the first day just to know where you are, but
Yeah,
yes,
of course, of course.
afterwards, don't
But
bother. Yeah,
but don't bother for the first 6 weeks, because don't expect to see any change. Okay? What we're doing is we're changing things inside the cell. And if you don't change those things inside the cell, then you aren't going to ever be able to get rid of that intramuscular fat that you're talking about, this myosteatosis, that is a signal that you're in a mitochondrially dysfunctional state. That's the risk that you're running when you're in that state. And invariably, you are also going to see problems with your liver. You're going to see fatty liver disease, or at least, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, arising. And you're going to see changes in your HbA1cs. They're going to rise up. All of those things go together because they're all part of this same failure to be able to metabolize fat and fatty acids. Now, the other piece that gets talked about a lot, and Peter Attia pushes this a lot, is that one of the most predictive characteristics that a person has about longevity is what's called VO2 max. Okay, that basically says, well, how far can I run? How well can I utilize oxygen? How well is my body using the oxygen that it's breathing in to generate energy? And
the
so,
efficiency of your cardiovascular system is essentially what that's
exactly.
measuring. Yeah,
And it's not just the cardiovascular system in the sense of your heart and your vasculature system pumping. It's how well your cells are taking that oxygen in and removing the carbon dioxide and using the oxygen in that oxidative phosphorylation
yeah.
pathway of generating energy, and how
Overall
efficiently.
cellular efficiency, overall functional efficiency of
Mhm.
getting nutrients in, getting the waste out.
Right, that broader sense of cardiovascular health.
Yeah,
And it is phenomenal how much that change and getting yourself into a higher VO2 max state can be predictive of longevity, and not just how long you're going to live, but how long you're going to live in a healthy state.
totally.
That health span as opposed to lifespan. And it all goes together, because what we're really talking about here is how effectively can you get your mitochondria to be able to burn fatty acids and not end up storing it in places where there's an unhealthy um, inflammatory signaling, stress signaling, and you pointed out, and I knew we were going to get there, to the autonomic nervous system, because cortisol level is driving this, insulin level is driving this, mitochondrial function is driving this. All of those things go to whether or not you're in that fight or flight sympathetic state or you're in a parasympathetic state. So people who are in a parasympathetic state, regularly, they're getting into that rest, digest, and restore state, are going to store fat in their periphery, in the skin, in the subcutaneous form, which is much less inflammatory, much less stress inducing. It makes you look a little soft, but it makes you healthy. If you're seeing people with that sort of barrel shaped body, that thick chest, thick waist, that is where the organs have a lot of tissue around them. If you see a little cellulite on somebody's legs, you see, a little fat on the underarm or something like that, that's far less important. That is, I'm sure there are people out there who are, very conscious of it, and they're going to wear long sleeve shirts because they're less concerned about that.
100%. From a health standpoint, no question about it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
just to point to it and just give you a quick way to understand if this is an issue. If visceral fat is an issue for you, you want to think soft muscle, hard belly.
Yep.
Really unique way to kind of just internalize that, take that and say, yeah, you know what? Belly's a little harder than it should be. And the muscle is a little softer than it should be. So muscle use, I think, is a huge piece to this. And you also alluded to fatty liver, which I think is the most, we'll do fun little air quotes here for those who are listening, famous, most well-known of the visceral fat accumulation based conditions, fatty liver, both in the non-alcoholic and alcoholic side of things. So non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is primarily caused by infiltration and excess carbohydrates, not fat. Really interesting. Make sure that you're aware of this. Dietary fat does not lead to increased fat in your liver. That is a huge misnomer.
Fat does not make you
Carbohydrates.
fat.
Exactly. Fat does not make
Carbohydrates
you
make
fat.
you fat.
And in fact, to prove this, one of the best therapies that has been proven through very significant research that's been done, having either mild to moderate effect on fatty liver on its own, is a ketogenic diet. So having a diet that's higher in fat and much lower in carbohydrates, carbohydrate restricted diet, is actually healthy and helpful in a situation of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or fatty liver overall. That's
100%.
a huge piece for people to understand, that dietary fat does not beget fatty liver, period. Easy.
Very easy. I completely agree. Now, the question is, are you going to gain the same amount of weight if you are gaining it in the viscera versus in the subcutaneous spaces?
It's a
And
really
the
great
answer is
question.
actually it's a little bit different, because what happens when fat is stored viscerally is that it slows your metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not just sitting around going to burn as much fat. One of the things that you want to do is you want to get more muscle built. You want to get healthy muscle. You want to get metabolically active muscle and tissue built up, so that even when you're sitting around, it's
You're
burning more
still burning.
calories. It's burning more fuel. Okay. If you store fat in the viscera, it slows your metabolism down.
And that's simply by the fact that you have less muscle tissue capable, and the muscle tissue is metabolically active. The mitochondria in muscle is so efficient and so functional and just so concentrated that as you include more fat tissue in the muscle tissue, you decrease the amount of muscle tissue, thus decreasing your mitochondrial concentration and efficiencies. So you're
So,
absolutely right about that.
and this is interesting because you can actually see it in what you eat. We
Mhm.
all know chicken. There's white meat and there's dark meat. Okay, then you find like another fowl, like a duck, and what you see is that duck is all dark meat. Okay, and the reason why the muscle is darker versus lighter is whether or not it's being used. Now, chickens that you eat, when you go out and you buy an oven stuffer roaster or whatever and bring it home, that chicken never flew around. Okay, there's no flying that happened. Maybe it walked around a little bit, but it didn't fly. So the muscles that controlled the wings never really got used very much, and
Which
so
is
it,
why
which
the
is why there was not a
breast
lot of.
is white meat.
Yep, the breast is white meat because there was no use of that muscle to the level that it would experience the biogenesis or the mitochondrial reproduction that you want to have, so that the number of mitochondria in the tissue grew. And in the dark meat, but they were walking around, they were carrying themselves around. So the dark meat, their thighs and their legs, is dark meat. You get the same thing if you're a hunter. People who have experienced hunting or eating wild, game meats. They know that if you go buy a steak, from a grass-fed steak, obviously, something that's good, or even any kind of steak that you buy at the store, typically is sort of a red color, but it's lighter than if you get venison or if you
Mhm.
get elk or you get something was a wild animal. Those animals much darker color to their meat, and the reason is more mitochondria. Okay, so you can sort of tell just by looking at the tissue whether or not this animal was healthy or not, whether this animal was out running around. Now it might be a little tougher because the muscle is stronger, but it's very healthy.
Absolutely. And so leaner meats, higher protein content, higher mitochondrial uh, concentration within those particular tissues. And when you take them in, then you get those same nutrients by your body breaking them down, utilizing them effectively. And that's how diet works: is you break down what you take in, you utilize it, and you reintroduce it and utilize it in your own body, and you create these new building blocks. And so that's a really important kind of distinction there, a really important piece to the overall puzzle. Why is What are some of the signs on blood work that someone can identify that they are dealing with fatty liver or more visceral fat? What are some of the signs that are available to people?
Well, we talked about a couple of them.
We did,
One is
yeah,
clearly your cortisol levels and your HbA1cs and
yeah,
things like that. Those are clear signs.
yes,
But liver enzymes also
yeah,
shift as you begin to get that sort of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, even before you get to the end stage of that, which, uh, you know, there's so much talk about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease out there. I just want to make certain that people really understand what we're talking about.
totally.
It is a shift from a healthy functioning liver into a liver state that is damaging to the underlying hepatocytes and infiltration of immune cells that try to heal. And your liver is, even back in or not prehistoric, but ancient Greek times, they knew the importance of the liver. The whole story of Prometheus, the titan that stole fire from the gods and gave it to man, and he was punished by being chained to a rock, and every day his liver was attacked by a bird or a hawk or something like that tore his liver out, and it would regrow during the night. They knew that the liver regenerated very well. The liver is a very important organ in your body, and it regenerates most of the time, but each time it goes through this process, fibers build up. It gets fibrous inside, especially if the cause of the damage is internal. And that fibrousness leads to what's called non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which then leads to cirrhosis of the liver. And it's a huge cause of liver failure. It used to be back 50, 100 years ago, the primary cause of liver failure was alcoholism. And then as we became more affluent and we started eating all these hyper processed foods, and obesity became such a challenge, and we won't go through the litany of other things that Western culture and the growing affluence led in terms of negative health consequences, we started to see that alcoholism started dropping with
Hmm.
respect to the percentage of liver failure and liver, need for liver transplants, et cetera. And the two other things that started rising were, one was this fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, and then the other thing, and it's timely, um, and without getting political, you know, there's, and I think that this episode is going to come out pretty quickly, but there's a big problem right now because people heard coming out of Health and Human Services in the United States and the president and the other health people in Health and Human Services and FDA talking about the fact that there may be a connection between Tylenol usage and liver problems, and well, not liver problems, and autism. And then, of course, there was a reaction where a whole bunch of people decided, well, that we're going to prove everybody wrong, and they were going to down a whole bunch of Tylenol. People.
That's such an odd way to protest something.
Well, it's a deadly way. And there are people, I mean, I want everybody out there to realize that 20% of all liver transplants in the United States are as a result of inadvertent Tylenol poisoning. Acetaminophen overdose causes liver toxicity that is very serious. In fact, 50% of acute liver failure deaths, 50% are the result of acute Tylenol toxicity. So whether or not you buy into this idea that Tylenol is behind autism, and I can sit here and give you very good reasons why it could be, and one or two reasons why it may simply be an association and not a causative thing. But I think my personal opinion is there is grounds to believe that there is a cause here. But independent of that, do not go out and take large doses of Tylenol thinking that somehow you're making a political statement, because what you are doing is injuring yourself. And for those people who aren't necessarily going to do something that's stupid, okay, but are just, they use Tylenol rather than using Advil or aspirin or Nuprin or Aleve, they use Tylenol, okay? Be aware of the fact that Tylenol, which is acetaminophen, has been put into so many other medications that you might take at the same time. You know, if you have a cold or flu, or you think it might be allergies, and you take some Benadryl, and the Benadryl doesn't help your symptoms, so then you think, well, maybe I got the flu and I'm going to take a Dayquil. And then you say, well, but my headache is still there. I'm going to also pop a couple of Tylenol. Understand that every one of those medications I've just mentioned has acetaminophen in it. So inadvertently, you have taken 3 separate doses of acetaminophen when you thought you only took 1 Tylenol.
Yeah.
Okay. That's how this toxicity occurs. And I realize that this is off the topic of visceral and subcutaneous fat, but since we got involved in talking about the liver, I just want people to think twice.
I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. And I think liver is just so important to understand that we like to think of the liver as the detox organ, which, yes, that is a major, major component of what the liver does. In fact, it's probably number 1 on the list, but it does so much more. It does so much. It regulates your blood sugars. It regulates your iron levels. It regulates so many hormones in your body. Your insulin levels are linked heavily towards liver function. There's so many things.
Food.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's generating bile.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't digest your foods properly, especially fatty foods, which we want you to eat fatty foods. They won't break down properly without your liver functioning.
And it takes time to build to a point where your liver can handle fatty foods. So just going straight keto may not be the best way to do it. There's ways to get there, but we completely are on the same page.
Almost everything you eat is going to pass through your liver first.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that is the first thing that the blood supply that is drawing the nutrients and the things out of your digestive tract sends it to the liver.
Straight
through
the portal vein system. Exactly.
I mean, that is just insane that anybody would risk, liver toxicity.
Yes, I completely agree. So the liver here is of highest value. And when it comes to visceral fat, the liver is kind of level 1, where we're aware of most of these conditions that are linked to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So let's go through some strategies, because we talked about a few, but I'd love to just kind of outline a top 3 list of what are the things that people can do to lower their visceral fat burden, not just in their liver, but also in their muscle, in their pancreas, because that is an organ that can be heavily affected by fat infiltration. The first one I want to bring up is fasting, because we've talked keto. We'll go back to that. But fasting is, and has been proven to be, intermittent fasting has been proven to be a wonderful and very, very effective way in lowering non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or lowering the fat burden in your liver.
And the reason for that is really insulin.
Yeah.
What does intermittent fasting do? I mean, let's say you've decided that you're going to have an 8-hour window in which you're going to eat. Okay. Now you got 16 hours before you're going to eat again. Okay. There's some period in which you're digesting your food. And then there's some period in which that food is going to, the sugars in that food are going to be circulating through your bloodstream and are going to be providing your cells with energy. Okay. And then you're going to run out of that glucose. Okay. And then there's glycogen, which has been stored in your muscle. So if you're going to do anything that's active, et cetera, you're going to burn through that glycogen. Now, there's not that much of it. Yes, you can build up your muscle's ability to store glycogen. So if you're a marathon runner, you have a better capability of storing glycogen than say if and your liver stores it also,
Mhm.
than if you're a largely sedentary individual. But that's going to be worn out by maximum, 8, 10, 12 hours in. So you're going to have a good anywhere from 4 to 8 hours of time in which your mitochondria are going to have if your body wants energy, it's going to have to find another source. And there's only two other sources. One is fatty acids, and I'm going to include ketone bodies in that fatty acid, that and then it's protein
Yeah.
because your cells can use certain amino acids as fuel for creating energy. But that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what you want to do is limit that amount of time when you're eating so that your body can get the insulin levels down and need fuel. And what happens when insulin levels are down and fuel levels are down? The fat that is going to be mobilized is going to be the fats that are available for high threat moments, and that's your visceral fat. So you're going to lose the visceral fat. The good news is you lose visceral fat first.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the really good news, that provided you're not overly stressed, your body is going to actually use that visceral fat first.
Mhm. I
So
think the
that's
efficiency piece is really helpful, and that is where the empowerment and some of these great pieces of information can come in really handy for people, because if you utilize intermittent fasting and we do these next couple of things, we start doing some physical exercise, physical movement, right? Getting those muscles working again mobilizes the fats that are located within those muscles. It helps to physically push out these fat tissues, these adipose tissues, these droplet cells physically are not capable of handling this. And so it actually is going to enable to the mobility or the mobilization of these fats out of this muscle tissue. So for people that have myosteatosis or that have high visceral fat levels, going for a walk is so powerful. Weight training 2-3 days a week is so powerful. Using your leg muscles, getting up off the chair and going for a short walk. You don't need to get to 10,000 steps, get to 7 before you get there. Work your way up, but make sure that you're utilizing your muscles really effectively. When you utilize your muscles, the fat can't infiltrate nearly as easily, and it sticks to subcutaneous, and we can mobilize more of that visceral fat. So that's a huge piece of the puzzle. We talked a little bit about keto. How does keto do this? In the same exact way that fasting does, I imagine.
It's exactly the same thing. You're shifting the energy type of energy that you're giving your body. When you go keto, you are limiting glucose. You're forcing your liver to take that fat and take those sugars and convert or what remains of the sugars and push them in the direction of making ketones and ketone bodies, which is, your brain loves them. There's now new supplements out there for, that are ketone IQ and other things like that. That I've got them. I use them. Some people like those B12 shots that are filled with sugar and caffeine in the afternoons. I hate those things. I would much prefer to take a shot of ketones, and you just feel sharper. You don't feel jittery. You feel healthy. You feel energetic. You have an afternoon run you want to go on. It's so much healthier. Um, but the other piece of this, because I know we're going to get to this. This is the third piece. You said exercise and intermittent fasting, and of course being keto.
Yeah.
But the other thing is get your cortisol levels down.
Yeah.
How do you get your cortisol levels down? That is meditation. That is proper sleep. This is one of the reasons why sleep deprivation and sleep restriction leads to metabolic problems, because of the cortisol.
Yeah.
Okay. Your body recognizes the threat of being awake when you should have been asleep. And so you end up with higher cortisol levels, and cortisol levels, you just said, shifts the fat storage in the direction of visceral fat. So if you want to lower visceral fat, if you want to mobilize that that fat out of those cells, lower your stress levels. And, we talk about it all the time. So I'm going to do it again. If you don't have time to sit and meditate for 2 hours, and if you don't have time to, do cold plunges and, and some of the other things, chanting and humming and those other things, which those are relatively easy to do. But vagus nerve stimulation is a very effective, very rapid way to enhance a healthy weight loss program, especially getting rid of the visceral fat.
This is great. We did an episode a while ago on the link between GLP-1 and vagus nerve and talking about the stretch receptors and the chemoreceptors and how GLP-1 is signaled through the vagus nerve. In addition to that, we all know vagus nerve is the parasympathetic nervous system primary channel, right? It is the rest, digest, recover state. We cannot heal when we're stuck in sympathetic because the cortisol is driven up, because we're under stress. When we don't sleep, we're sending a signal to our body, thinking through an evolutionary perspective that there is a threat. There's got to be a reason why you are not sleeping right now. There must be something that I need to be hypervigilant about. And so it reacts by increasing your cortisol, increasing your norepinephrine, putting you into a state where you're ready to react all the time. The next day, when you wake up after 4, 5, 6 hours of sleep and you don't feel great, it's because you've spent the whole night with cortisol going and glycogen being produced and your liver and your body working in a hyper stressed state. So helping to create that shift through vagus nerve stimulation, through sleep activation, through all of these important, yes, they're basic, yes, they're foundational, almost sounds too simple to be true. But these are the things that are the foundational pieces that support your body in optimizing and lowering those visceral fat producing opportunities. Those epigenetic and genetic factors become nullified, or at least can, on the epigenetic side, can be changed, right? We're able to start creating shifts, and it has to happen relatively slowly. Just like you said, JP, it takes 6 weeks to really start to create those internal changes at a cellular mechanistic standpoint to start to see that you're becoming more efficient at burning fat, that you're able to do the fasting more easily, and that your microbiome changes are also benefiting this as well. So all of the pieces come together. It takes time, it takes repetition, and it takes a compounding effect of putting these little pieces together to create this massive result of optimizing your metabolic health.
There's something that gets talked about a lot in the context of AI and the development of and the speed with which we're seeing these updates that are coming, and how fast chips get more powerful following what's called Moore's law. And what they're talking about really is an exponential function. Okay, without getting into the math of it, we have you can add 2 and 2, you can take 2 to the second power. There's lots of different ways that you can compound on prior work that you've done. Exponential is by far the fastest. Okay, and human brains aren't really designed to predict and think about things growing exponentially, and yet so many things that are in our environment actually do grow that way. The famous story is that the man who invented the game of chess was a peasant in India, and it sort of went viral in the 8th century. And all of a sudden everybody was playing this game of chess. And the local king, Maharaja, whatever, was taken by it and brought the peasant who invented it in and said, this game is so beautiful, it's so elegant, so subtle. I want to give you something. And he said, whatever you want from my treasury, you can take. And the peasant was very humble. And he said, I only want to feed my family. I just want to make certain we have enough food. How about we use the chessboard and we'll put 1 grain of rice on the first square and 2 on the second square and 4 on the next square, and we'll just double it and we'll go around the board. And the Maharaja said, sure, that sounds great. Well, as the story goes, at the end of the first row, it's like a teaspoon of rice. At the end of the second row, it's a cup of rice. And by the end of the third row, it's several bags of rice. And by the end of the next row, it's wagons and wagons and wagons of rice. And by the time you get to the end of the board, It is more rice than has ever been grown in the planet Earth. It's a mountain larger than Mount Everest. Okay. That is the power of exponential growth. And when you begin this process, you of exercising and changing your metabolic state, the first day you're going to change 1 or 2 mitochondria. The next day it's going to be 4 or 5. By the next day it's 10 to 20. The next day it's 100 to 200. And before you know it, at the end of 6 weeks, your whole body, the trillions of mitochondria, are now in a state to lose weight. And so when you lose absolutely nothing on that first day and absolutely nothing the second day, and by the end of the first 2 or 3 weeks, it's immeasurably small, don't worry, because 99% of what you're going to lose at the very end. Okay. That's where you're going to get to the point. I want to encourage people. It may seem like you've lost nothing after a month, but I guarantee you're going to get to the point where the weight literally falls off you like the sweat coming out of your pores. It is going to come off you that rapidly. And it's all going to happen in a couple of weeks. People are going to look at you and go, "What? Did you have surgery?" It's that fast once you get the system working. But until it's working, it's not going to lose weight. You have to change the system first.
You have to change the inputs to make the system work efficiently and readily and have that system ready to go so that it is that 1 grain of rice doubled every single day until it reaches that peak of growth. I think that is a great way to kind of wrap a bow on this wonderful episode. Any final thoughts as we call it?
No, I think this is a really important episode for people who want to understand what fat is and the different types of fat, and understand the health consequences of subcutaneous versus visceral fat. We didn't really highlight it, but cancer rates are substantially higher for people who have lots of visceral fat than it is for people who have subcutaneous fat or are lean. The same thing is true of autoimmune diseases. It's also true of neurodegenerative disorders. It's also true of mood, depression and anxiety issues. All of these things, especially, and this is for women, when you go through menopause and you have that withdrawal of estrogen has been a huge benefit to you in suppressing the immune system. If you don't, during that period, get out and do exercise and change your diet, get to a more ketogenic diet, get rid of all the sugary
pastries,
carbohydrate,
and the
pastries, and all that.
sugars.
Get that out of your system. When you're going through that phase of your life, you need to really focus on your health, because if you don't, it's going to be a really uncomfortable time, and the long-term consequences are going to be serious. I mean, osteoporosis and muscle loss and cognitive problems, cardiovascular problems. All of those things arise if you don't keep that inflammation in check. And the way to do that is to exercise and eat right.
I love it. I think this is a great episode for anybody who got to this point. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something from this one, clarified or got rid of some of those myths or some of those misinformation pieces that are out there with regards to subcutaneous versus visceral fat. And this is an episode that absolutely should be shared. Send this to 1, 2, or 3 people who you think could utilize this information and use it to upgrade their health. We'll catch you all very soon on the next one.